I'd like to thank everybody and welcome them to the Dallas Literary Festival. Uh, right now, we're actually going to be discussing family fiction and fever dreams. A Strange Object presents Farthest South, Farthest South, and today I have with me Ethan Rutherford. Did I pronounce that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Good to see you.
Hey, it's good to meet you. All right, and also I have with me. See, I just had all the information. Jill Meyers. You run the, if I remember reading this correctly. Let's see. The was it? Is it a south? Was it a south side? South outside? I forgot. I apologies for the bad pronunciation.
I'm the editorial director of A Strange Object, and we are part
Yes.
of the Dallas Press Deep Vellum.
Good. Yes. All right. And I believe a book is actually supposed to be released in April. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. That is Ethan's collection, Farthest South.
Good. All right. So that's good to hear. Okay. I'd like to thank everybody for joining in. And if you have any questions that you would like to ask during the conversation, please do put that in the message box below. And as we hopefully as the conversation goes on, I'll be able to answer. We can ask those questions. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started because we've already wasted enough time. All right, so Ethan, do tell us more about the book, or what you can tell us about the new release you have coming out.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, Eddie. Thank you so much. And it's so nice to see everybody. I mean, it's such a weird time right now. We're just like, well,
Yes, it is.
so we're like, are we in the right? Did we get portaled into like an alternate reality? Like, this is one of those like funny things. But it's really nice to. I wish I was down there in Dallas with you guys. I hope that everything is going well. So, and I also see Stacy. I've just put everything on the Stacy Swan is down there in the corner, which is like really lovely. We'll try to mind. So the book that I'm here to talk about, I'm really thrilled. It's my second collection of short stories. It's called Farthest South. And I'm thrilled to have it with Jill at A Strange Object, which is part of Deep Vellum. Jill and I, we've known each other for a long time. She edited and actually with Stacy, they're running American Short Fiction. And so we have a long history, and it's really wonderful to get this book back to her. And it's also sort of great. I wish that we were in the middle of the coronavirus year of great stress, so I could actually come down to Dallas and give everybody a big old hug. But so I'm thrilled about it. So it's a collection of short stories. There's 9 short stories in there. And Jill and I will talk about the ways in which they're linked.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Yeah. So, Jill, could you tell us more about the work that you do in Austin? Actually, because when I was reading just a little bit about it, it seemed like you're. I was like, wow, this is actually very interesting. I'm actually kind of surprised. I was like, oh man, I got to go to Austin more often.
It's a good city too. Yeah.
Yeah.
We should burn up the I-35 corridor a little more often. We should drive back and forth. With A Strange Object, that is a press that I co-founded in 2012 with Cal Collins, and she and I sort of the way that we think about the press and now the imprint is that we are absolutely fiction obsessed. We really care a lot about fiction, and with the name of the press, A Strange Object, it really helped us sort of guide as we were making choices, as we were acquiring books for the press. We were really thinking about like books being sort of strange and beautiful objects in the world, and we wanted the things that we produced and the books that we edited and worked with people on, for those to be really remarkable objects, for them to be sort of the right size in your hand, to feel really good, so to be like lovely objects, but also to be strange, or to really sort of make you think, or look at the world in a really different way. And I feel I feel very confident that we've continued to sort of make those choices of sort of finding books that are offbeat, or sort of that speak in a different register, that speak a different experience. And one thing that's
Hmm.
been really exciting over the last several years is really to see those books find their audiences, find critical reception. One of our books was named one of NPR's best books of the year. Another one won a Believer Book Award. And then Ethan's book is already getting some wonderful, even before it comes out, getting some pre-pub reviews. He's gotten 2-starred reviews, one in Publishers Weekly and one in Kirkus. And so it's really thrilling to sort of see that people are excited about these books as well.
That's good. That's good. Yeah. So when I was doing whatever research that I could on it, unfortunately I was not able to get a handle of the book because even working at a library, we don't get those pre-orders like that. We really don't. So when you talk about when I was reading about it, it was like a collection of short stories. It really kind of seemed like you were really putting what as we one of the more fascinating things I would like to say in literary is like putting, you know, ordinary people in extraordinary situations. And I was kind of sort of really getting that vibe from at least from what the details that I could at least gather on about your upcoming book release. Would that kind of be an accurate description?
Oh yeah, yes. I mean, that's what you're sort of, that's kind of what you're trying to do with short fiction, because you sort of, you know, you have a limited amount of time to sort of throw everybody into the deep end to some degree, right? So
Hmm.
what you kind of, so this book, we'll talk about it a little bit, but this book was sort of obsessed with family and kind of the fever dream that happens in sort of the early stages of having a family, where you go like, am I doing this right? And
Right.
also I haven't slept, and like, am I hallucinating?
Hmm.
Um, and so one of the things that, before I talk about those particular stories, I mean, you're exactly right. These are stories about sort of parents of small children who kind of find themselves in extremis and kind of having these strange experiences. Um, and one of the things that Jill was talking about earlier that I really love, and I love that you're dialing in from the library, but one of the things that's really lovely about The Strange Object that made me so excited to be with them is that she was talking about like having a book as an object. And so one of the ways that we actually were thinking about this book is we were thinking about it as sort of like bedtime stories for the end of the world is one of the ways that someone was talking about it. And so you can see like it's a nice sort of like book. You could, you're like, oh, it looks like a regular,
Right.
but there's also illustrations in it. And so that was one of the things that Jill was able to do wonderfully. We sort of were wondering like, how can we get like that kind of a little bit of like menace in like a third intelligence there. There's the text. There's also all these frame stories that are about parents who they are telling kind of bedtime stories to their kids, trying to sort of reassure them that life is going to be just fine and they have everything out of
Right.
control. And then these stories start to kind of unravel as they're telling them, and the kids are like, you know what, like you've made it a lot worse. But the thing that the illustrations were able to do, and we have them if we can share screen like later on if it comes time to that,
Okay.
is sort of have kind of a fairy tale, add kind of a fairy tale component to what are essentially kind of like, I think of them as domestic stories. My wife is like, like, in my family is like, you're crazy if that's what you think the domestic scene is. There's like giant squids and sort of like
Hmm.
lots of sort of strange violent. The body count in this collection is is lower at least than my last collection. Um, but that's what these short stories are. So your question about um, characters getting into trouble, what you're trying to do in a book of short stories is you're sort of orchestrating tension, and you're seeing what your characters are made out of. And it seems to me that the only way that, at least that I know sort of how to do that, is to put your characters in pressurized situations and see how they respond. And it's in how they respond to a situation that you'll come to know who they are as a character and have that particular experience.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, that's a that is fascinating. I always kind of always like to see like, would you really respond like this in this particular situation, or would you really kind of hit fight or flight mode? It is very interesting to kind of really explore. So that's actually quite fascinating. So you're next, Jill. So let's get more back to a strange object. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. We got the sun kind of blaring back. I apologize, everybody. It's it's a really sunny day today.
How hot is it down
when you
there?
talk about,
Eddie, how hot is it?
oh, so right now it's actually 80 right now. It's actually 80.
I'm
So I was like,
jealous.
oh man, I was like, I'm glad certain things are getting back to normal. So when you're talking about what your work do at a strange object, you're talking about a collection of stories. Have those stories really? I imagine you've been collecting during the pandemic, correct?
Mhm.
Yeah. Has the stories
Yes.
really? Has the stories kind of really morphed into something else because of our current situation, or is it kind of relatively stayed the same?
You know, that's a really interesting question. I feel one way that I talk about Ethan's book is actually so I acquired it before we like signed the contract before the pandemic, but then basically
Oh, right.
we've been working on this book throughout the pandemic and sort of
Oh, right.
sharing stories back and forth and like talking about, you know, what it's like to be Ethan and I are both parents, and we're just sort of talking about like the overwhelm of having your kids around all the time, or sort of like making the transition when they go back to
Hmm.
school, what that's like. So to say, like we've been on the book, but also really sharing sort of what's going on in our lives with each other over the course of the pandemic, and sort of in that way, like this book has become like my pandemic companion. It's really been sort of with me through like, oh, the first wave, oh, here we are going through the second wave.
Right.
It's yeah, it's really just sort of been, and to sort of um push on that a little bit. I mean, something that's interesting about the book, again, which was not written during the pandemic, but many of the stories have something to do with like a feeling of isolation, or sort of
Hmm.
being like cut off from the rest of the world. And yeah, so it was sort of very eerie timing, because I felt like the book could really teach me about that experience that I was living through, which was really, I don't know, it's just really powerful to encounter that as an editor, as someone who's reading and rereading these stories, and just to feel like, oh, like here are other people at other times, sort of moving through this experience of isolation, or sort of of fear of sickness sort of coming on you. Yeah, that was a very powerful experience. But in terms of other books that are coming in now,
Hmm.
I'm not like, I definitely haven't read like the pandemic novel, you know, like someone has sort
Yeah.
of like taken this experience and like turned it into art. I do think that's going to happen, but I think it may take a while longer sort of for it to settle in our brains. But it's funny, I am getting lots of pitch letters where people are like, oh, and you know, like th- sort of talking, a way of talking about the book and situating it sort of in the pandemic, not that it's like about our time right now, but just like something in reference to what we've all experienced during the pandemic. I feel like
Yeah.
people are kind of bringing that into how they talk about books generally. I think that like we look to books to certainly to like shake us up and to bring us into new perspectives, but we also look to books for comfort and, you know, like ease and pleasure. And so I feel like that a lot of people are sort of pointing to those things too, as like this is like a balm or some kind of solace after the pandemic.
Right. Okay. That is an interesting perspective to kind of think about it. Yeah. It's you gotta. It's like the shift happened, but you don't know in like what ways it's happened yet. You really
Yeah.
don't know. So it's pretty interesting. Okay. So let's now just go ahead and discuss the book. Ethan, what is I guess the whatever you can tell us, because I would encourage everyone to go buy the book. I would encourage. So what's kind of like the I guess the format of how you went about the process on this one?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And one of the things that Jill was talking about, one of the great things that I'm going to carry this working on the book with Jill was one of the only things that sort of was kind of buoying me and like keeping me up on the surface during the
Hmm.
pandemic. And the resonance that I think was happening for us with a lot of these stories. And you were talking about this earlier, Eddie, with like that sense of like putting someone in kind of a strange situation. Is it like
Hmm.
fiction thrives on interruption? interruption is when kind of like the story begins. And we were working on these stories that were trying to give shape to various interruptions. So in one, there's a father leaves, or something else sort of enters, right? Something goes on a journey, or a stranger comes to town. And we're doing it in the midst of this huge interruption, which is virus. I mean, it's an interruption that to end all interruptions, everything sort of stopped. And one of the things that was interesting, at least for me as I was working on it, is that we were talking about, if you talk about sort of the virus as plot, I was talking to my students about this. We were trying to talk about what plot is supposed to do. And what plot does is it interrupts something and then in a pressurized way reveals, so that over the course of the story, you see something about who you are as a person, or something about a situation or power structure that you didn't see before. That's plot. And so if you think about like the virus as far as plot, it kind of incredible what it starts to kind of dredge up. And so having that kind of resonance and sort of talking to Jill about these stories, we were close. There were a couple of stories we were like, should we actually change this? There's one of the stories in here that was actually about set during sort of the Salem witch trials. And we're like, should we maybe sort of have this instead of kind of like, could we sort of have this be a virus? And you just don't have the stomach for it. We were like, it's not necessary. What is recognizable is that sense of isolation, that the world has changed, that sense of a little bit of helplessness. And I don't know about the rest of the folks here. I'm not quite ready to read about like COVID directly on the nose. I don't feel like we're out of it. Although I was going to say, I was just reading an incredible book. I don't know if you can see if this is coming up, but Zadie Smith has written these wonderful personal essays that came out in the middle of the pandemic. It's called Intimations. It's really great. She wrote them in like real time about her, just because she's one of the great writers and great minds of literature, writing about the experience of going into the pandemic, and then sort of what happened over the course of the year, including sort of all of sort of the protests and all that stuff it's like reporting in real time. It's really incredible. But my book is just as good as Zadie Smith's book, so buy the book. So as for the stories, I mean, I would say that my story, like I like to sort of, I was saying earlier that these stories are sort of further afield. In kind of they're kind of domestic, and I would also actually split these stories in half. So there's 9 stories. Half of them, I would say, are what you consider to be like away stories, that they're stories that kind of happen in stranger times. Like there's one where someone is, so the Farthest South is a reference to, there's a story that's a kind of a historical fiction. It's also a fever dream that's about the exploration for the South Pole. And it's the story of a failed expedition in the South Pole. There's another story in there, we're talking about the witch trials, about 2 siblings whose mother has died having been accused of witchcraft. And it's their father who brought the people to the house to take the mother away. And they were thinking, like, what are we supposed to do? We're afraid of our father. How are we supposed to act? And the sister starts to exhibit sort of these symptoms as well. And then there's another story where a baby is, young parents have a baby who's born with gills, and they bring him to the hospital, and the hospital is just, I don't know, hopefully you guys haven't spent too much time in NICUs with children. My son, when he was born, we spent some time in the hospital. Just one, he's fine. He's really annoying right now. He's fine though. And we just had this like incredible experience where it was just this revolving door, and it was like we kind of lost control and lost the whole thread of the narrative about how we're supposed to care for our son, and felt incredibly helpless. Then there are the stories that are, I would say, what you would call closer to home. In these stories, there's 3 stories in here, and they focus on a family of 4, Hannah and Soren, and they have 2 kids. And they're frame stories, and they're all stories where someone is telling a story to somebody else about something that happened to them, or trying to help them face their fears by trying to create sort of a narrative around that. So on one level, it's very domestic. It's just a father telling a story, trying to get his kids to go to sleep. On the other level, as the story progresses, it just gets weirder and more sort of dangerous and threatens to break that frame in the telling. So he's not getting an award. He's trying to be the best dad, but he's not going to get awards for being the best dad because the kids are going to go Thank you. Thank you for the nightmares. So putting it together with Jill, one of the great pleasures of working with Jill is that she has a collector's mind in a lot of ways. And I think thinks deeply also about like albums and music, and which is the same way that I think about a collection. So some short story collections I think are just, you just sweep the desk and you go like, well, I wrote that, so that goes it. I wrote that, so that goes it. That one. This book is a crafted book, and it's essentially modulated like an album. You have the first story that kind of introduces you to the themes, and they're all sort of interrelated. And you do meet Hannah and Soren and their family 3 times over the course of these interlocked stories.
Oh, that's good. It's good to know. So I guess we're gonna segue into you. So I think one question that I'm actually curious about, Jill, is like, as far as like publishing during this, how has that been? Has it been like worse, or just like you haven't really noticed the difference?
I mean, certainly there's more opportunity for events like this. I mean, I have like it has been really interesting to see the way events have, flourished online, and that there have been lots of conversations happening. And I think like, people from all over the US like getting together on a Saturday afternoon for a conversation about literature. And I think like that is a really I guess like here now we are, more than a year into the pandemic, and it's still like this thing that felt like sort of this plucky little pivot that we were doing. Like we're still doing it, and it feels like to have this level of access, I think, to writers and thinkers and artists, and to like bring them together, I think is just like a wonderful thing that we've found during the pandemic. And that I do think that, some as events are going to shift to, sort of like some in person or hybrid or something like that, I do think we're going to continue to have this option. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. It doesn't always have the same like feel in the room, obviously, as like getting a bunch of humans together
Right.
at a bookstore or at a library, something like that. So I mean, it definitely, I've seen in publishing, so certainly things have some publishers have delayed publication dates, or just kind of tried to not maneuver around the pandemic, I guess. I mean, that's one thing that I've been seeing people do. But I feel that there have been so many just like really groundbreaking conversations that are happening over Zoom and other formats that are just really impressive, and that I want us to be able to hold on to. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah, it has been. So I guess this is kind of a question for both of you. Like, as far as like creative writing, have y'all seen more of it or less of it recently?
Well, and I also want to say too, to everybody sort of here, most of the cameras are off, but you please feel free to jump in. I mean, one of the things that Jill was saying is like, it would be so great if we were all in the same room together.
Yeah.
It's also great if we were all just like having a beer together, something like that. But we're also very happy to answer any questions, trying to find a way to make this screen feel more like a room. So please jump in, or put them in the chat or something like that.
Oh yeah. I encourage everyone to use like I said, I understand we only have like a certain amount of time, but we have this time. So I encourage everyone to, if you have a question for Ethan, if you have a question for Jill, please do put it in the message, and we can hopefully answer it as we continue going on.
Yeah.
But yeah, but one thing that I have noticed is I find myself, especially during all of this, is being a little bit more expressive, whether it's like, hey, how did you feel today? Just kind of write it down. Or if it's like, you know what, today I wanted to do a podcast or something. So I ended up doing that instead. So that's part of the reason why I asked that question. Like, I would imagine like with your students, they probably have submitted probably far more unique creative works. And Jill, I'm pretty sure you probably got these collections of stories where it's like, I didn't even know people even felt like this. But I kind of wanted to kind of like explore that just a little bit.
Yeah. So here's something that's really interesting. That's a really great question, and really interesting to think about, because one of the questions that we have is like, what is the value of making things during
Mhm.
a time like this, right? And um, I don't know that I sort of have the answer that is anything better than accept it. Like, it makes you feel good to do something, and the way to sort of push against cruelty is beauty to some degree, and try to participate in beauty. What I'm seeing in my students, I'm seeing a lot of brains that don't work. Like, my brain isn't working either. And I'm seeing a lot of brains that are sort of kind of hitting stop signs in weird ways. And one of the great things, though, that happened to me in my teaching this is that we were all feeling it, and we finally just confronted it and said, this isn't working, is it? And so we started to think much more about process rather than results.
Mm.
And so we started working groups, and we're like, okay, if you can just work for 25 minutes today and just make something that wasn't there before, but it is here now, then you have something to work with sort of later. Or even if you just sort of sit and kind of just make the space to like do nothing and allow yourself to not be busy.
Mhm.
And uh, uh, for the first time, I've never thought of writing as therapy. I go to writing to like, I like seek pain, and I'm just like, okay, what could I do to like make myself feel anguish now? Oh, writing. And this is the first time I've actually ever felt that it was a healing thing. And I felt it with my students, because you go, it's consistent, you're making something, and it has a value that can't be diminished because you've done it. Um, I, in terms of like the things aren't sort of going quite bonkers yet. Craft is kind of out the window, but they're coming up with like great ideas. So, and once you kind of start, you take the pressure off making something perfect, and perfect, it actually starts to become like more beautiful, more authentic, and in that way, kind of more perfect. But
Mhm.
you can't talk yourself there. You just have to do the process. But Jill, I don't know what this is. This is a question for both of us. I'm just yammering away. Are you seeing, are you seeing interesting things in terms of submissions for you?
Again, I don't think that I'm yet seeing much that has been written during the pandemic. So I'm in anticipation of sort of this wilder or sort of rougher, like rougher work that might be coming that has these really powerful ideas in it. That sounds really exciting. I'm trying to think. I mean, what I've noticed, and this doesn't necessarily sort of pertain to writing, is just that it feels like this time has given people. I mean, yes, we've been in isolation, and like maybe we can't gather with other people in sort of traditional ways, or maybe um, our brains, our nervous systems are sort of always just on the alert, but that people have been able to take this time and really um, I don't know, like find something new. Like it may not be, if you are a writer and you're in the middle of a novel, you may not be able to, like make any progress on that novel. Maybe you've written a song, or maybe, like maybe you've kind of been able to inhabit a different creative space. And that's something, I mean,
Mhm.
just in terms of like my peers and like the humans that I know, it seems like people have really been able to sort of take this time and yeah, not maybe not make progress on sort of their major project, but they're off like creating other new worlds, or yeah, opening up new spaces. That feels really exciting.
Kind of really exploring new options, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, that's always good. That's always good. So, as far as like the process of like working on the book together, how was that like? Was it pretty straightforward, or was it like, hey, look, your Zoom link is like not working today. Can we just try again tomorrow?
Uh,
um Ethan, what do you think?
oh, it was the thing that got me through. Like, in one of the things, I mean, you just sort of heard Jill sort of talking about that kind of way that people are pivoting. And Eddie, you were mentioning that as well. It feels like that
Mhm.
sense of writing is now, at least for me, sort of become more of just like a creative thing. And you can sort of create in this way, or you can create in that way. And sort of that.
Mhm.
So working together with Jill was, I've always loved working with Jill. She edited the first story of mine that really seemed like it seemed like something sort of new happened. And over the course of this year, there were just a series of sort of like really terrible events that happened. And I mean, globally, but also sort of personally, right? Hard year for a lot of folks. And talking to Jill was buoying. There was something about that sense of we never shied away from the work. We never put things off, but it sort of became a way to kind of talk about the other things. So so that's an emotional level. Like I never would have imagined that an editor could be as great as Jill, and I couldn't be happier. I mean, every idea that we sort of came up together, she was like, that's great, let's make it happen. And I'm gonna give you, like, I'm gonna just push you just a little bit, and it's gonna be better than you thought it was. And I know you're not gonna like it, but I'm gonna push you more. And that was perfect. Like, just in sort of, I hope everybody here at some point gets a chance to sort of get to know Jill and have a beer with Jill. She sort of does that, like, it's the gentlest of nudges where you go like, I'm like, yeah, that's great. And I'm like, oh, no. She actually really doesn't like that. I need to go in and fix it and impress her. She's a great editor in that way. On a craft level, Jill has a sort of a perfect eye for the stuff that I don't, which is sort of like, what is this? She's not in love with the sentences that I feel like I'm in love with. And so she can let them, she goes, this really isn't sort of holding its weight here. This was confusing. And then also helped me see the larger arc to the story. I was pretty caught up in the 9 stories. And Jill helped me sort of see the larger arc between the opening story and the closing story that essentially act as parentheses to the book. So that's something that the book never would have arrived if it wasn't for those observations.
That's good. Okay. So one question that I always kind of love to ask, because I don't really honestly get the chance to kind of really talk to an editor and like an author. I don't really get the chance. You would think so working at a library, but I assure you, it doesn't work out like that from time to time. But one thing I've always wanted to know is, what is like something about creative writing that a lot of people are really not aware of, Ethan? And for you, Jill, what is it about like being like a challenge of being an editor that no one really would think it would be a challenge, but it's full on, like, it faces you every day? Like, what's kind of something about the creative writing process and the editing process that really not much of the public really knows about, but they should be aware of, to kind of like, you know, hey, if you didn't like that part of the story, please understand there was other parts that were terrible. It just didn't work.
Yeah. If you hated this, get a load of what's on the B side of this. Yeah,
exactly.
Eddie, I love that question. And I mean, I do think that one of the things that is true of editing is that, you know, if you do your job really well, your work will be invisible. You know, that you are assisting in sort of like the best production of the author's vision. And you know, you're sort of in there listening, you know, really listening hard to what the author wants to do, and sort of, I don't know, imagining that with them. So some, you know, changes to like the order of the collection, or changes to maybe you would just like tweak the ending of a particular story, or lightly edit some dialogue or something like that. If you are, like if you are, I feel like a good editor who's like sort of communing with your author, like that stuff is just going to read like, well, that was an incredible story. You're like, Ethan Rutherford, you know, did it again. And I mean, that is, I feel like, as it should be, but that the work of the editor really does sort of disappear for the reader. And I think that's something that I strive for. I certainly don't want to be like heavy-handed, or, you know, there's some editor-author relationships that sound like very contentious, and that the editor comes in and just like hacks away. And that's not my approach. And I yeah, and I just sort of hope that what shows up in the finished book makes the author proud and excites the reader.
Yeah, so what, just sort of pulling this, because I imagine there are a number of writers in the audience. So Eddie, I don't know, are you a writer, Eddie? You write?
No. It's not really something I've always wanted to try, but I never got the chance to.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, now's the time. Now's the time.
Now is the time.
You can join me. We do it for 20 minutes every day. No, I'm kidding.
Gotcha.
So the question was, what is something that you sort of didn't know, or that you kind of wish every sort of writer knew? But and the thing that I wish that someone had explained to me that I think is really true is that just how necessary and wonderful editors are, and to embrace that it's a real gift to find an editor. It's not about someone who likes your stuff, but it's who sees your stuff for what it is. And it doesn't always happen the first time. And I think that there's a tendency when you're writing, particularly to hold it all a little bit too tight because you made it and you feel like you sort of know it better than everybody else. But a really great editor is just crucial to seeing a project through. They point out patterns that you didn't see, and they make it better. They somehow, a good editor will make a book or will make the stories more themselves, if that makes sense. And one of the things that I say in my creative writing class, I think this is true. Someone said it to me once, and it took me, many years, but to actually like internalize it, was that when somebody tells you where a problem is happening in your work, they're almost always right. When they tell you how to fix it, they're almost always wrong. And one of the things that Jill is, and I think she shares this with other great editors I've had, is they know exactly to go, all right, well, listen, this isn't working so well compared to sort of what you're doing, right? So you need to figure out how to solve it. And it's that sense of jumping back in to sort of solve it that allows you to kind of come back to your story. So someone just said a good editor sometimes can hijack your story. Yes, and what I would say to that, Rubina, thank you for chiming in. This is the one thing I love about Zoom, is that everybody can sort of do this. Hello.
Yeah.
Is that that's not a good editor. That if a good editor comes and tells you and says, oh, here's what I would do if it were my story, you go, that's a sign that you kind of should sort of perhaps run for the hills, because it is right. Your story. So my comment would simply be, your note is a good editor can sometimes hijack your story. That's a bad editor. A bad editor will help your story become the story that you kind of recognize it, and will keep your intentions intact and not say this. So there's a very famous, and I won't talk for any longer about this because we can sort of, but there's a very famous editor and writer relationship, Raymond Carver and Gordon Lish. And Raymond Carver would send these sort of long stories, and Gordon Lish would be like, that's great, we just need to cut here and cut here and cut here. And the story would end up being a third of the story that he submitted. Now, Raymond Carver got incredibly famous on the stories that Gordon Lish did, but they are Gordon Lish's stories. And as Raymond Carver had more time to sort of think it through and sort of gain his confidence in himself as an artist, he ended up republishing, and people helped him republish those stories, much that he felt were more true to sort of like his vision. It's a really great question that you have, and it's something that you need to pay attention to as a writer, because editors can really help, but then there's always a line where you go like, well, is this my story or is it the editor's story? And only you have that barometer, Right. My suggestion, if you find yourself in that situation, is just to say, thank you so much for your advice. Get up and walk around, like take a long walk and see how that advice settles. Because sometimes when it feels like they're hijacking your story, it's just because they don't like your story as much as you like your story, So just take the feedback, walk it around, go yell at somebody who can take being yelled at, and then you go back to the editor and talk things out.
Gotcha. Okay, so we did get a question. One person wanted to know, how important is having an arc to an overall flow of a short story collection? And and then the person meant it as like more of like, for you, Jill, it'd be like, as an editor perspective, like how do you kind of make sure it's still represented? And for you, Ethan, as far as like what you should keep and what you should leave out, like as far as like building your characters and building the flow of the story?
I will say that the story collections that I've published, and I've published quite a few, that's primarily what I do. We have a debut novel coming out from A Strange Object next March, but I don't work on novels very often. I really love short stories and short story collections. And of the story collections that I've published, they are that, you know, it may not be sort of a novel in stories, like it may not have sort of characters who reappear. Like I would not say Ethan's collection is a novel in stories, but he does have characters who reappear across several stories. And that's absolutely like a pleasure as a reader to get to encounter them again. But I've worked all the collections that I published are thematic in some way, and it may be extraordinarily loose. Like one story collection that actually the co-founder of A Strange Object, she acquired and we put out together, was called The Great American Songbook. And they're stories that sort of loosely like move around jazz in some way, and it's not, you know, it didn't have like a central jazz figure showing up in every story or something like that, but those stories were connected by theme. And it's, yeah, I feel like all the story collections that I've worked on have something like connective tissue, if not sort of an arc, that really brings the stories in conversation with each other. And you sort of, Ethan was talking about earlier, I think, I don't know if you use the word song cycle, but I feel like you do use that term sometimes to talk about your work. And I feel like I'm very drawn to story collections that are like the stories are resonating with each other and sort of progressing or slipping back and forth, that they're really talking to one another. And I've never published like someone's collected stories where, you know, they just sort of like sweep everything off desk, as Ethan was saying, and, you know, like put that in the collection. There's nothing that I've worked on that's resembled that, which is not to mean that I wouldn't consider it, but so far I really like a thematic collection, a collection that has an arc to it.
Got it.
And as I'll answer just really quickly, I mean, it's a little bit more of a mysterious process for me in terms of like what stays and what goes, except that you just know. You just go like, that's not my best. I tried and it's not my best. And you just sort of do it. And you just, over the course of years of sort of doing this, you have a sense, you kind of get this heat-seeking sense where you go, oh, that was close. And that feels warm to me. This feels like I'm trying too hard, or it doesn't fit. And when you're thinking about a collection, like I read about all sorts of crazy stuff. Like I read a lot of like weird historical, I'm working on a novel now about whaling, which is like, someone's like, have you read Moby Dick? I was like, yeah, but it's, you know, but with this collection, you go like, this collection is trying to accomplish very different, like a very set specific thing as a book. And it doesn't always, stuff doesn't fit. And you just kind of have to hone the mechanism where you go, that doesn't work. That color doesn't fit in here, or what have you, if you sort of have different arts, and you just kind of get a sense for it. And you just have to be kind of ruthless about it.
Okay, we got to wrap it up here, but we got one last thing. Is I'm gonna give it like we'll end it on an audience question. How do you pick the ending of your story?
Hey, I'm sorry, Eddie. We don't have any time left.
Oh, no more time left. Oh, okay.
The other event is waiting, but thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us in Rabina.
Okay.
If you'd like,
We appreciate
Rabina, send
it.
me an email if you'd like to. I'll answer that question over email. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all so much.
Thank you all.
All right, thank you so much, guys.